The cloud, we've all heard about it, but how do we migrate to it? Today, I'll be running you through a migration we've just recently completed with one of our clients and my top 3 tips on how to migrate to the cloud. I'm Matt Grace, Managing Director at Flying Donkey. Let's do it. Alright, you've got some on-premise equipment and you want to migrate to the cloud. In this video, I'm going to take you through how we transitioned a client into the cloud and my top 3 tips on how I did that. Tip number 1, know your current infrastructure. I know it may sound obvious, but you need to know your current infrastructure and you should have a topography map of it. This should include all servers, firewalls, backup processes, and any other auxiliary items attached to your infrastructure. You'll need to know the specs and the details on these so you can transition them into the cloud. For the client that we performed the migration for, they had 3 key things we had to migrate. One was a large single VM server that ran both their application and database. Secondly was their USB hard drive monthly backup. And thirdly was their hardwired firewall that had a bunch of whitelisted IPs protecting their network. We had to note down the size of this server, how big the hard drives were, how big this processor was, as well as the USB hard drive, how big it was, how many backups it took. And on the firewall, we noted down all the IPs and configuration settings that it had, so we knew exactly what we wanted to do and transferring it to the cloud. This moves nicely into tip number 2, migrate on a like-for-like basis. Well, as much as you can. This really should be my number 1 tip, but when you're migrating, try and migrate on a like-for-like basis. What that means is, rather than trying to go and look at all the serverless technologies or containerization that the cloud does offer you, try and transition as much of a like-for-like as you can. If you simply run a VM internally, set up a VM in the cloud. If you run a firewall, set up a firewall in the cloud. We can look at these more interesting and difficult technologies later on. The real challenge here is just getting your on-premise infrastructure into the cloud. Back to the client that we've recently migrated into the cloud. With the 3 key things we were looking at, this is what we did. Firstly, we matched the VM that they had to a VM in Azure. We simply migrated like for like from the VM internally onto the VM in Azure. Secondly, from the SQL Server, we actually couldn't migrate internally from the SQL Server to Azure because there was a secondary requirement from the client to enable encryption at rest. So what we did was we matched versions like for like into the Azure SQL Server and did extensive testing on this. And this does fall outside of my tip, but we needed to do this as it was a side requirement. Thirdly, for monthly backups, we looked into the Azure backup, which gave us the monthly backup that was being existingly done. Again, at this point, you could add on Azure Site Backup or further point-in-time backups on the database, but for the initial step, we wanted to match it like for like. And finally, we set up Azure Network Security Groups. This was to match the existing firewall, and we set up all the same existing firewall rules in this firewall. Tip number 3, review, resize, and plan. After being up and running for about 2 to 3 months on the cloud, it's time to review and resize your applications. While we did attempt to match like for like on the existing applications, Azure's servers do run differently to your on-premise ones, and therefore you might find they perform better or worse than your existing infrastructure. You can now log into Azure's portal and check on their monitoring over CPU, RAM, and hard disks, and see if the servers are performing the same, and you can scale them up or scale them down as needed. Once you've got the server scaled to the right point, now's a good time to lock in what's called reserve pricing. This is where you'll save up to 30 to 60% on the overall cost of your machines, because you're telling Microsoft that you want to use the server for an extended period of time. The final step is to plan, and by that is plan what technologies you want to use within the cloud. From Azure's perspective, you may want to use their Azure App Logic, which gives you some serverless capability to run maybe your APIs on a serverless platform rather than on the VM. Or you might want to use their Azure Blob Storage, so you have dynamic and scalable storage rather than using the hard drive attached to your VM. Now that you are on the cloud, it's a lot easier to do this than trying to transfer this in the migration. For the client that we did the Azure migration on, we had to resize their VM down by about 50 to 60% before we locked in reserved pricing. We do have plans in place to use Azure App Logic for some serverless applications, and we also have some plans to use Azure Blob Storage for some on-demand storage. Some other things we've been looking at is spinning up some additional resources for servers, for applications that previously weren't able to be spun up. So there was no on-premise resources available to do them, and now in the cloud we can actually add those on. So 2 or 3 extra VMs have been spun up to facilitate those things. Overall, the message here is try and migrate on a like-for-like basis and don't change anything on the fly. Once you're in the cloud, it's a lot easier to change and add things rather than trying to change it in an already complex migration process. Good luck with your on-premise to Azure migrations, and if you do have any issues or questions, feel free to reach out and we'd be happy to assist how we can.